So, Clorinde's drip marketing should have just come out, and instead of sawing about it and making a 10-minute video on a still image, we got some early kit info on Clorinde, so let's discuss that and her potential. Hello there, Flip here, and today I'm very excited because we got the first tiny Clorinde crumbs towards what her kit is going to be like. Normally I wouldn't make a video on just kit crumbs as we don't have the full kit, so there isn't much to talk about. However, this case is quite different due to the fact that off of what we were given, which was via a very credible leaker, there's already so much to discuss about Clorinde's potential and how she can be one of the strongest DPS in the game if they give her the right scalings to accommodate. I also get the pleasure of talking about one of my favorite reactions in the game, so that's just another plus. But enough yapping, let's begin. We were given some screenshots of cliff notes about what she does, so I'll try to word it the best way possible to get the very basics of her kit down, so bear with me. Press E to pull out the blicky, which changes your stance, and when you press E again you'll do a stab, and if you dash in this stance you can do a stab attack while getting iframes, and it seems like this is going to be her main source of damage. I just want to state that this is a stance change from the wording and not an infusion, and since her gun isn't mentioned anywhere else and she pulls out her gun for the beginning of the E animation, I'm just going to make an estimated guess and assume that if you do normal attacks while in this state, she'll probably fire her gun. This is why I fucking hate kit crumb. But even with that, this is already quite interesting. A lot of characters have had issues with poison interruption resistance, and now you seemingly have Clorinde who's able to do damage while iframing, which the only character I can think of that can do that currently is Wanderer. Next, we don't really know what her burst does yet, but we do know what her ascension passives do. One of them is going to give her 20% crit rate when she consumes a bond of life, so her burst is most likely going to generate a bond of life in some way. And the big one, which is what made me want to make this video in the first place, and that's that Clorinde is not going to be locked into Chevreuse teams, like a lot of people expected, but instead, she's going to have a talent similar to Nouvelette's Draconic stacks but for electro reactions. The reason why this excites me so much is because it explicitly states in the leak that will be based off 3 different reactions, and there happens to be an electro reaction that is able to create multi-layered reactions at base, and have teams built around that. And I'm talking about EC or Electro Charge, the most underrated reaction in Genshin. Now before taking a dive into why this is so good for the ult, Goth Raiden, let's discuss why a lot of things are aligning in Clorinde's favor. If you look at Fontaine's 5-star lineup as a whole, almost every one of them is the staple DPS for their element. Linny for Pyro, which I made a video talking about, Hydra has Nouvelette, Geo has Navia, Jeonyeon made Zhao the staple DPS for Anima with no real competition, and and Grizzly is the most consistently good cryo DPS as he works great in non-freeze teams, even if in optimal scenarios Ayaka can get faster clears. So that leaves Denjo, which just didn't even get a spotlight in Fontaine at all, as it's just had its region, and it leaves Electro, which Clorinde is Electro if you didn't notice. Fontaine units also have passives that boost the fuck out of their stats, or just have innately high scalings. So I feel like it's quite safe to make the assumption that they're planning to make Clorinde the staple DPS for Electro units in terms of her talent damage. They're also giving her Bond of Life mechanics, which is massive because it means that this artifact set is going to be good for her. Its 2-piece effect gives attack, meaning she has Bennett synergy, and this won't be overridden by C6 as she has a stance change and not a basic Electro infusion. But somehow C6 Bennett deniers will still say wait for future units even though it's been 3 years. And the 4-piece effect of this set is just 54% damage bonus. She also gives herself 20% crit when she consumes a Bond of Life, so it's not even like you massively lose out on the ease of use that the Hunter set has. And unlike the Knave who also has bond mechanics, Clorinde seems to not want to consume her Bond of Life, making her not have anti-synergy with healers. So yes, just at a base there's a lot going for Clorinde to make her a contender for the top DPS. Now let's get into why her multi-element incentivization, I'm not sure if that's a word, but let's talk about why it's so good by explaining why Electro Charge as a reaction is one of the best and what teams it gives Clorox access to. The base numbers of EC aren't really that impressive, but the main strength lies in the fact that when you trigger Electro Charge, you will have both an Electro and Hydro aura on the enemy, leading to some very interesting interactions. The easiest one to explain is going to be EC swirls, which is what happens when you combine an Electro Charged aura with Onimo. This will lead to you swirling both Electro and Hydro at the same time, which is good for VV or Kazuha setups, as you can pretty much consistently get a double swirl, and it is actually good for damage as well when you're in multi-target scenarios. An EC swirl in single target would give you 2 damaging swirl procs, and in 2 target you get 6 damaging swirls across both targets, on top of the fact that if you have Kaza who absorbs an element, you also get him to proc EC on top of this, for another layer of transformative damage, which happens multiple times in a rotation and why EC teams can feel so good when you're against multiple enemies. This idea is the principle around standard taser teams to have consistent EC swirls with an Onimo driver, and even nowadays you can still see the this philosophy for some Clorinde and Nouvellette teams, where you have a strong on-fielder alongside passive transformative damage. For Electro characters, the strongest EC teams we have now are Raiden Double Hydro, in which Raiden isn't even a carry geared to take advantage of EC. Raiden is just a good driver for Furin and Yelan. And the team gets like 2 Electro Charge procs rotation. The reason why we don't have a good Electro-oriented EC team unlike Hydro-oriented EC teams is due to the lack of good survivability options. Nouvellette with Furina can heal himself a lot due to her healing bonus, making him HP positive, and he has such a ludicrous amount of range that you can just steer away from enemies and still hit them consistently. And on-field Kokomi just heals so much, so you can obviously slot Kaza in there. If Gun, Mother is able to offer some sort of sustain for herself that is decent, she will easily be able to slot Kaza on these teams. Or another route they can go is to just open up some combos where you can incorporate plunges, because then you'll be able to add Jeonyun to the team and get your consistent swirls that way. Dashing is an attack for Clorinde, and dash cancelling is a way to speed up plunges, so that can be a really nice synergy with Jeonyun compared to Raiden, who doesn't get buffed by plunges. So you can get double Electro plunge teams, double Hydra with Kaza if Clorinde can sustain herself, and also double Electro with Kaza. It all really depends. Now next, let's talk about some more slightly complicated EC stuff in the form of Overvape. Again, with the Zap Zap reaction you have 2 auras, and now instead of adding Onimo, if you add Pyro, then you'll trigger an Overload and Vaporize reaction simultaneously, for an interaction theory crafters dubbed Overvape. And this is strong because it adds overloads in addition to your big vape hits, and also weakens the Pyro aura, allowing you to have more consistent vape. There are quite a few ways to play Overvape teams. The most popular one is Raiden National because of Raiden's synergy with high burst cost characters. Then you have Onimo oriented Overvape, or just Kaza Overvape really, where you use Bennett to apply Pyro to Kaza to guarantee a Pyro aura, and then you have Electro and Hydro characters trigger EC, and then Kaza will swirl and apply Pyro for a massive chain reaction, also known as soup teams. The last way to play Overvape is with the Pyro on-fielder, where you just add Fischl in your last team slot, which unless Clorinde can do off-field damage at C0, I don't really see, So with the Overvape teams that will work for Clorinde, you will either use her in soup or with Zhangling as a driver. I don't see her being that great with Zhangling, as Raiden works because she can offset Zhangling's atrocious energy needs. So for Overvape teams, I can only really see soup being good. And that is just Clorinde's Bennett Hydro Kazuha. However, I do want to point out that typically characters released close to the end of a patch are made with future version characters in mind, like how Kazuha was and how Kuki was to an extent. So we are going to get a plethora of Pyro characters flowing into the next patch, and if we get a more energy cost efficient Zhangling, that will enable Clorinde as an on-field driver for off-field Pyro DPS on Overvape teams, which will be really good. Now with that out of the way, I guess we can discuss Dendro teams. I feel like a lot of people underestimate how strong Electro is universally for Dendro teams. Besides Hyperbloom and Aggravate, obviously, when you apply Dendro onto an Electro Charged aura, you will generate 2 seeds, increasing your average seed generation, even for slower applicators, and this is why for Burgeon teams you will see Fischl used a lot just because she adds in her own high damage, on top of not interfering with seeds as also targets enemies directly most of the time, and Electro also helps to reduce burning up time. Though if we assume Clorinde has some decent AoE, then you can't really use her like that, as in Burgeon and Hyperbloom she would just trigger the seeds, and you also don't want to make her a pure Hyperbloom bot on full EM, as she most likely is going to have very high scalings, which would be wasted in this case for no real benefit, leaving the only Dendro team I can see being solid for her being Quick Bloom, which is a mix of Hyperbloom and Quicken. This is kind of similar to Overvape in where you have Clorinde doing a solid amount of talent damage with some Hyperblooms on the side, which is the core idea behind Sina's most premium team. Overall, for Dendro stuff, I'm going to be very surprised if our best teams are here. Dendro teams took a backseat for pretty much all of Fontaine to make way for talent damage. If you look at all the Fontaine DPS, the only ones that really have good Dendro teams are Nouvellette, and even then his Dendro teams are worse than just using him as a hyper carry. So while I do see the potential for Clorinde to have very good Dendro teams, especially in Quick Bloom and just Aggravate, I don't think they're going to be her most defining. That concludes my Schizo rant about EC, since the rest of her teams are mostly simple, so I'll just quickly brush over what she has outside of Hydra teammates. As mentioned in the leak itself, she's going to have quite strong teams with Chevreuse, as most people expected. She's an Electro carry and a Fontaine Electro carry at that, with a high chance for her talent damage to be overtuned, most likely making her the best Electro DPS for this archetype. From there we also just have plain hyper carry teams with Bennett and Kazuha, and then Fischl or Sarah can be slotted in for the last slot like with Raiden teams. Lastly, we have Aggravate teams if she has quite frequent Electro application. And yeah, that's actually just it. All in all, she has the flexibility down, with the only character she doesn't work with being Cry units, just because Superconduct doesn't really do anything. Kind of like Navia and the Fontaine story quest. So, we have talked about why Clorinde has so much potential to be one of the strongest DPS in Genshin. We've also looked into all of her team options and concluded that she definitely has the flexibility down, on top of having access to some of the stronger team archetypes. And with that out of the way, what else would Clorinde need to cement herself at the top? Let's discuss it. The biggest and most important thing Clorinde is going to need is the damage. Despite all the positives I've listed, if she doesn't have the scalings to back it up, she's just not going to be great. People will gravitate to what's easier or what does the most damage, and usually what people view as the best is a mix of both. Yanfei is a character that has amazing quality of life in her base kit, making her very easy to pilot, but no one is picking Yanfei over the high tier Pyro 5 stars because she just does less damage than them. If you were to lower Nouvelette's damage by half, barely anyone would use him. Most of the healers in Genshin were really good in terms of support and survivability, but people only used Bennett because he enabled the most damage over a healer. And Sharina, through her damage bonus that can only be activated by healing, is what enabled people to use more healers, as they now enable a damage bonus. So again, despite how flexible and how many teammates Clorinde can abuse, if they don't give her the scalings to back it up, which considering their track record in Fontaine, I'm pretty confident they will, then she won't be as highly viewed as the other prestigious DPS. The next thing our gun waifu is going to need is decent survivability or defensive utility. She already most likely won't need that much interruption resist, as her dodge attacks seem to be her highest multiplier, which she gets iframes during. But on top of this, being able to heal herself would be nice, especially if she also has a bond of life to clear, as to heal you would first need to go through that bond of life, potentially making her survivability awkward. The last thing Clorinde is going to need is hopefully some sort of AoE or just a nuke, as that would just make her more comfy or consistent to play, so hopefully she can take after her mother in that regard. But we'll see when her full kit details come out, which should be later this week, we'll see. And besides the constellations, I think that's it. Clorinde can easily be a top 3 DPS in Genshin depending on how the devs decide to handle her, just because there is so much untapped potential within Electra DPS that can take advantage of all the strengths Electra has to offer. And with her incentivizing multi-elemental play, having a bond of life mechanic, giving her access to a very strong artifact set, and her self-crit increase, I really do see a scenario in which Clorinde can outshine a majority of the damage dealers we have currently. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on Clorinde, as I'd love to hear and respond to almost every single comment. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.